What if everything you thought you knew about the samurai was missing a hidden truth? We picture them as stoic warriors loyal to their lords, living and dying by the code of Bushido. But behind the armor and the sword was a tradition rarely spoken of, a culture of same-sex bonds that tied samurai to one another in ways deeper than battle. Did these relationships strengthen loyalty on the battlefield? Were they part of an accepted code or secret acts kept in the shadows? And how did poetry, art, and temple records preserve what later generations tried to erase? You're about to enter a chapter of samurai history that was almost forgotten, but not completely. Before we begin, drop a comment. With the time you're watching this morning late night, doesn't matter. We see you, and if you want history that asks the questions most avoid, consider subscribing. No pressure. But here we go, where the textbooks won't. Ready to step inside the hidden world of the samurai. Let's begin. What if the legendary samurai, those men of iron discipline and razor-sharp blades, carried with them not just stories of war, but stories of love that history often refused to tell? You picture yourself stepping into a wooden dojo at dawn, hearing the scrape of swords drawn, the snap of bamboo against armor. The men inside move with precision, their eyes sharp, their breath steady. To everyone else, this is a scene of battle training. But if you lean in closer, you notice something unspoken, weaving through the drill's bonds that run deeper than strategy, loyalty, or duty. In samurai culture, loyalty was everything. To die for your lord was considered an honor. But the same devotion often appeared in personal relationships, especially between warriors. You might expect that their code, Bushido, left no room for tenderness. Yet the opposite is true. Letters, poems, and even chronicles reveal that samurai were not only fierce fighters, but also people who carved out space for emotional and romantic attachments with one another. Imagine a young warrior writing a poem by lantern light. The lines don't boast of battle or conquest, but whisper about affection for a fellow soldier. Japanese poetry, with its spare images of blossoms, moonlight, and fleeting beauty, became the language of love. And in some cases, those verses were directed toward other men in the camp. What survives on fragile paper hints at how these emotions were not hidden in the shadows but folded into the rhythm of everyday life. One reason it feels surprising is that we often picture warriors as hardened, unfeeling, yet real life rarely matches the stereotype. Think of a modern soldier today who carries a photograph of a loved one in his pocket. The battlefield does not erase the human need for connection, it magnifies it. For samurai, the sword and the heart coexisted, even if later historians preferred to polish one side of the story and ignore the other. And there's another layer: trust. In a world where betrayal meant death, sharing intimacy with another warrior wasn't just about desire. It was about building a bond strong enough to survive chaos. Some chronicles mention pairs of warriors who fought side by side with a loyalty sharpened by their personal attachment. Can you imagine the difference it made, knowing the person guarding your back was not just an ally, but someone bound to you by something deeper? Of course, these relationships weren't always equal. Status mattered, as it did in every part of Japanese society. Older samurai sometimes guided younger ones, teaching them not just martial skills, but also cultural and emotional lessons. To us, that might sound complicated, but to them, it was part of a system that tied mentorship, discipline, and intimacy together. When you think of a samurai standing tall in armor, what do you picture? Stern-faced sword at the ready, unshakable focus now. Add the unseen private lines of verse, exchanged in secret gentle gestures, hidden behind the clang of steel, a promise whispered before marching into danger. The history of the samurai was never just written in blood and iron. It was also written in moments of affection that the official stories tried to scrub away. You step away from the clashing swords and notice something quieter shaping the world around the samurai. It has a name, Nanshoku, literally male colors. The term might sound poetic, but in medieval Japan, it described real relationships between men, and it was written about so openly that no one thought of it as scandalous. You find it in Buddhist texts, in warrior tales, and later in plays and novels. Instead of hiding it in whispers, Japanese society often treated it as just another form of human bond. Samurai were not separate from this. In fact, they helped shape how it was practiced. And if you want proof that this wasn't just theory, you only need to look at some of Japan's most famous names. Take Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who nearly unified the country in the 16th century. Beside him was Mori Ranmaru, a young attendant known for his loyalty, refinement, and devotion. Chronicles describe how Ranmaru was not only Nobunaga's aide in battle, but also his intimate companion. When Nobunaga met his end at the temple of Honnoji, Ranmaru chose to die alongside him. Was it duty? Was it love? Maybe both. But the bond was so strong that history still remembers their names together. Nanshoku wasn't invented by Nobunaga, of course. Earlier, lords such as Takeda Shingen also had close male companions recorded in letters and accounts. These weren't treated as shameful secrets. They were noted in the same way as marriages or alliances. And then there was Ihara Saikaku, a writer in the 17th century who published Nanshoku Okagami, the great mirror of male love. His book collected dozens of tales about samurai and monks, showing just how normal and widespread these relationships were. Imagine if today a best-selling author openly published story after story about same-sex couples in the military. It gives you a sense of how much visibility Nanshoku had. But Nanshoku wasn't without rules. Usually, the bond paired an older, experienced warrior with a younger one. The younger partner, called the wakashu, was expected to show respect and devotion, while the elder provided guidance, protection, and status. If either failed, if the elder betrayed trust, or if the younger was careless with loyalty, critics would call the relationship dishonorable. It wasn't judged by the love itself, but by how well both sides lived up to the samurai's ideals of loyalty and discipline. You can think of it a bit like mentorship today. A senior figure takes on a younger apprentice, guiding them in skills and values. But here, the emotional closeness could also include romance, which made the bond even stronger. In a time when betrayal could mean death on the battlefield, having someone who trusted you fully, both as a warrior and as a partner, was a powerful thing. And it wasn't hidden from everyday life. Poems, plays, and paintings all mention nanshoku. Samurai might write verses comparing a fellow warrior's beauty to cherry blossoms or describe loyalty that went beyond friendship. For them, it wasn't a contradiction. The same man who pledged his life to his lord might also pledge his heart to another warrior. When you hear the word samurai, you might picture only swords and duels. But in reality, their world was just as much about feelings as it was about fighting. Nanshoku gave those feelings a place, a name, and even honor. And when you see Nobunaga and Ranmaru standing together in history, you realize it wasn't just rumor. It was a tradition carved deep into the culture of Japan. You follow the trail of Nanshoku and find yourself inside a quiet temple school where boys in plain robes kneel beside their teachers. These boys are called chigo, young attendants, or apprentices, who often served monks or warriors. At first glance, it looks like a scene of discipline and study with the boys copying sutras or carrying messages. But history tells you there was more happening here than just lessons. The chigo were not only students, they often formed close bonds with their patrons, monks, lords, or samurai who guided them. These relationships mixed education, mentorship, and at times, intimacy. That might sound unusual to modern ears, but in medieval Japan, it was woven into the system itself. The idea was that affection and loyalty helped shape the boy's character, preparing him for adulthood and the strict world of the warrior. Writings from the time describe how such bonds could be praised as noble if handled with respect. Loyalty was the key word. If the older patron betrayed the trust, or if the younger apprentice was careless with devotion, the relationship would be criticized. But when it worked, people admired it for teaching discipline and deepening bonds. The logic was simple. How can you be trusted with the life of another man in battle if you can't be trusted in matters of the heart? One of the most famous accounts comes from warrior tales that describe pairs of samurai and their chigo companions going into battle together. The elder promised to protect the younger, promised to stay loyal. Sometimes the stories end tragically, with both dying side by side. Far from being mocked, those tales were told as examples of courage and fidelity. If you want a real example, think again of Mori Ranmaru, who began his service to Oda Nobunaga as a youth. He wasn't only Nobunaga's attendant in political affairs, he also embodied the ideal of the devoted chigo. His refinement, his loyalty, and his choice to die with Nobunaga were celebrated as the perfect expression of the code. Chronicles didn't erase that relationship, they recorded it. At the same time, not everyone admired the system. Some critics accused it of being indulgent or corrupt, especially when older patrons abused the trust of their chigo. Literature of the period sometimes satirized lords who flaunted their relationships too openly. It shows you that even in a culture where nanshoku was recognized, people still argued over where to draw the line. Think about it like this. Even today, we debate what's appropriate in mentor-apprentice or teacher-student relationships, where boundaries should be and how power should be handled responsibly. Medieval Japan wasn't so different. They wrestled with the same questions, though, framed inside their own customs. You look at the walls of a temple hall and imagine the quiet scratch of brushes, the murmurs of prayers, and behind it all, the personal dramas, admiration, longing, loyalty that don't appear in the official records. These boys grew into men who carried both the discipline of training and the memory of those bonds, stepping into the world of swords, with hearts already marked by personal histories that never made it into the grand epics. What if I told you that in samurai Japan, love was not only spoken, but drawn, painted, and even mass-produced for eager eyes? You picture yourself unrolling an old scroll, the paper crackling faintly, only to reveal scenes that feel startlingly open. Men embracing warriors in intimate poses, all carefully inked with the same skill, used to paint landscapes or flowers. This was shunga, the erotic art of Japan, and it didn't shy away from same-sex love. Shunga wasn't hidden under floorboards. It was traded, collected, and sometimes even gifted. Samurai, who prided themselves on their swordsmanship, also kept these images tucked away in their trunks alongside armor and poetry. The images told stories that words sometimes couldn't. You might see two young pages leaning close in a tea house, or a seasoned warrior depicted with his favored attendant. The art didn't whisper. It showed boldly that affection between men was part of the world around them. One of the most famous storytellers of this world was Ihara Saikaku, who in the 17th century wrote Nanshoku Okagami, the great mirror of male love. His collection of tales describes samurai lovers and monks with their young companions, framing their bonds as courageous, passionate, and often tragic. Far from being censored, his book became popular reading. Imagine someone today writing dozens of stories about military romances and having them passed around as common entertainment. It tells you how accepted these themes were in their own time. But shunga was more than entertainment. It acted like a cultural record, capturing what people felt but rarely said out loud in public. In a society that valued order, art gave people a safe space to explore desire. Think of how movies or novels today sometimes tackle subjects that everyday conversation avoids. Shunga did the same thing, except with ink on paper and brushstrokes that could travel across provinces. Of course, critics existed. Some officials complained that shunga distracted warriors from duty or that it encouraged softness. Yet the demand never stopped. If anything, criticism seemed to prove just how widely these works circulated. The art survived precisely because it meant something to the people who kept close, something worth the risk of being caught, with images that authorities grumbled about, but could never fully suppress. And in those delicate lines and bold scenes, you see how samurai society handled contradictions. The same man who pledged his life to Bushido could also be the same man who treasured a print of two men in an embrace. It wasn't a contradiction for him, it was simply another side of human life. The sword, the brush, and the heart were all part of the same person. So when you roll that scroll back up and imagine slipping it into a lacquered chest, you realize that art didn't just decorate samurai rooms. It preserved the proof that desire was not whispered in shadows, but brushed into color, left to survive for centuries, waiting for someone like you to find it. You walk away from the painted scrolls and hear the faint echo of temple bells. The sound draws you into the world of monks and meditation, where swords were set aside and silence ruled. But here, too, the story of love between men is written quietly into the fabric of life. Temples weren't only centers of religion, they were also schools' libraries and training grounds. Many young boys entered as acolytes, learning to read, chant, and serve. And in that environment, bonds between monks and their attendants became part of daily rhythm. Buddhist writings from medieval Japan didn't shy away from describing these relationships. Some monks argued that the affection between teacher and disciple could help strengthen discipline and loyalty. The idea was that if a boy devoted himself fully to his mentor, he would also grow into a man who understood devotion to the Dharma. In practice, that devotion often blurred into intimacy. The influence of Zen made this even more interesting. Zen prized discipline, self-control, and the stripping away of illusions. Yet in Zen monasteries, stories of affection between monks and their disciples circulated widely. Some even claimed that such bonds sharpened the mind, giving focus and inspiration to meditation. To us today, that might sound like a contradiction, but to them, it was part of the way human feeling and spiritual practice intertwined. And because many samurai trained in temples before stepping into the warrior world, they carried these influences with them. A boy who grew up serving tea to his master in a monastery might later find himself serving a lord in a castle. The habits of loyalty and closeness learned in one setting easily carried into the other. If you want a concrete example, you can look at the literature of the time. Some temple chronicles openly praised pairs of monk and disciple who were remembered for their loyalty to each other as well as to their practice. Others criticized those who were careless, suggesting that affection without discipline was dangerous. It was a debate that mirrored the larger society admiration when the bond deepened loyalty criticism when it crossed into indulgence. Think of it like modern debates about balance. How do you keep emotion from interfering with discipline, or can emotion actually strengthen discipline if channeled the right way? The monks of Japan wrestled with those questions just as soldiers do today. Temples also left their mark in art. Some of the earliest Shunga scenes of male intimacy were linked to monastic settings, showing how deeply the tradition was tied to Buddhism. These weren't created in secret, they circulated because people recognized the practice as part of life. So as you sit in the quiet of a temple courtyard, cicadas buzzing in the summer air, you realize the silence is not empty. Behind it is the hum of relationships that shaped boys into men, monks into masters, and samurai into warriors. The temple was a place of prayer and discipline, but also a place where human bonds, sometimes tender, sometimes complicated, were carved just as deeply as sutras on a scroll. You leave the temple grounds and step back into the camp of warriors, where armor gleams in rows and swords hang polished at the ready. Here, the language changes. Samurai didn't just practice loyalty in silence. They wrote it down in codes, manuals, and rules. And hidden in those codes between the lines about honor, courage, and obedience were hints about how affection and love were meant to be managed. The most famous framework is Bushido, often called the way of the warrior. It sounds strict and cold duty, sacrifice, death before dishonor. But when you read closely, you find passages and anecdotes that show how emotional bonds were not ignored. Instead, they were tied into the larger idea of loyalty. A warrior who could stay true to his beloved was also proving he could stay true to his lord. In other words, love wasn't a distraction from discipline, it was a test of it. Take the warrior code known as Shido, an earlier version of Bushido. Some manuals praised bonds between samurai, saying that affection kept men steady, brave, and focused. A samurai who feared for the safety of his beloved companion might fight even harder, never breaking rank. Think of it like athletes today who push themselves to the limit, not just for personal glory, but because someone in the stands matters deeply to them. That mix of emotion and discipline can be a powerful motivator. Stories from the period show how this worked in practice. A samurai might write a farewell poem to his companion before battle, promising loyalty, even in death. Another might boast of courage by saying he would rather die with his beloved than live dishonored. These weren't just romantic flourishes. They were ways of binding the personal to the professional, the private to the battlefield. And sometimes, codes warned against excess. Manuals reminded samurai not to let affection slip into indulgence. Too much distraction, too much time away from training, those were marks of weakness. A balanced relationship, however, could strengthen both men. It was all about keeping the line between devotion and duty sharp, like the edge of a sword. Real names prove the point. The bond between Oda Nobunaga and Mori Ranmaru was remembered not only for affection, but also for discipline. Chroniclers noted how Ranmaru managed Nobunaga's affairs with perfect order, while Nobunaga trusted him absolutely. Their relationship wasn't dismissed as gossip. It was tied into Nobunaga's image as a great warlord who inspired loyalty in all forms. Even centuries later, writers like Ihara Saikaku framed samurai love as a kind of training in honor. In his stories, a young man who betrayed his older companion wasn't just faithless in love, he was faithless as a warrior. By weaving emotion into moral lessons, Saikaku showed how society expected relationships to reinforce, not weaken the samurai way. You glance at a set of armor in the dim light of a storehouse and realize it wasn't only polished steel that held these men together. Behind the crests and blades, there were invisible threads of loyalty and desire bound tight by codes that saw no contradiction between fighting bravely and loving deeply. What if the theater itself became a place where love blurred lines, where men stepped onto the stage and played both male and female roles, and audiences applauded not just the performance, but the fluidity of it all? You walk into the world of kabuki, in the bustling pleasure quarters where samurai merchants and townsfolk mingled, and where same-sex desire was not hidden but dramatized. Kabuki began in the early 1600s, originally created by a woman named Okuni, who performed dances in Kyoto. But before long, women were banned from the stage, and young men called wakashu took over the roles. They didn't just play women convincingly, they became objects of desire themselves. Samurai, in the audience, sometimes fell in love with these performers, who blurred gender on stage and carried that fluidity off stage as well. The pleasure districts of Edo, like the famous Yoshiwara, were filled with courtesans, entertainers, and performers. But alongside women, there were also young male companions, admired for their beauty and artistry. Paintings and woodblock prints from the time show samurai meeting these actors, giving them gifts, even writing poems about them. The kabuki stage and the brothel corridor overlapped both spaces where identity could shift and desire could be explored. Writers like Ihara Saikaku didn't ignore this. In his stories, the love between samurai and kabuki actors is described with the same drama as any great romance, sometimes tragic, sometimes comic, but always central to the culture of the city. Imagine a modern celebrity crush combined with political intrigue that was the atmosphere of kabuki and the pleasure quarters. Of course, critics complained. Officials worried that samurai spending too much time in theaters or brothels would neglect their duties. Some even tried to regulate or ban certain practices, but the demand never stopped. For every critic writing warnings, there were artists painting prints of beautiful wakashu actors, sold to eager fans who collected them like posters. And in those prints, you see the continuity with everything you've already followed through samurai life. The bond between men wasn't whispered in shame. It was acted on stage, sold in books, and etched into the fabric of urban life. The fact that people argued about it only proves how central it was. If something is unimportant, no one bothers to ban it. You imagine sitting in the dark of a kabuki theater, the smell of incense and the rustle of silk around you. The actor steps into the light, his movements graceful, his makeup dazzling, his voice trained to slip between registers. The audience sighs. In that moment, gender becomes performance. Love becomes performance. And the samurai in the crowd doesn't care whether he is watching a man or a woman. He cares about beauty devotion and the thrill of desire played out under the lanterns. You step back from the bright lanterns of the kabuki stage and listen for the other voices, the ones weren't cheering. Not everyone in Japan celebrated nanshoku, or the world of samurai bonds. From time to time, poets, scholars, and officials pushed back, arguing that such relationships distracted warriors from discipline, weakened society, or strayed from what they considered proper. These criticisms never erase the tradition, but they remind you that debate always surrounded it. Some Confucian scholars who valued strict hierarchy and family order frowned on relationships that didn't lead to children. They warned that too much indulgence in male love might disrupt duty to clan and household. Their writings urged samurai to remember their primary responsibility was to produce heirs and serve their lords. To them, poetry about blossoms and moonlight wasn't noble. It was frivolous. Even within Buddhism, where nanshoku had deep roots, reformers occasionally tried to stamp it out. A few temple rules specifically forbade intimacy between monks and their attendants, calling it a distraction from meditation. Yet the very need to write those rules shows how common the practice was. It's like posting a "do not touch" sign. You only bother if people keep reaching for the object anyway. Literary critics also had their say. By the late Edo period, some authors mocked samurai who openly flaunted their young companions, portraying them as foolish or vain. Satirical plays joked about older lords chasing actors or apprentices, warning audiences not to take loyalty and affection too far. And yet the fact that it appeared in satire proves again how deeply it had seeped into daily life. If people are making fun of it, it means everyone recognizes it. One striking example comes from the Tokugawa shogunate, which occasionally issued moral edicts to curb what they saw as excess in theaters and pleasure quarters. Officials worried that kabuki, with its beautiful young actors, was drawing samurai away from their posts. They demanded stricter separation of classes and more regulation of entertainment. But the rules rarely stuck. The audience's appetite was too strong, and the actors too beloved. Think about how modern societies also argue over culture. When music films, or even fashion, challenge old values, critics write columns warning of decline. The arguments repeat across centuries. What counts as too much? What should be controlled? What should be left free? In Japan, the push to restrain nanshoku followed the same pattern. Anxious reformers tried to draw boundaries, but human affection slipped past them. As you walk through the quiet corridors of history, you can almost hear the whispers of those critics' stern voices scribbling rules into scrolls. But the louder voices belong to the people who kept carving, painting, writing, and living their bonds anyway. The resistance was real, but so was the persistence of love. You notice the tone of history shifting, like the sound of a shamisen string pulled too tight. For centuries, samurai bonds and nanshoku were written into poems, plays, and chronicles without shame. But then came the Meiji era in the late 19th century, and suddenly the air grew colder. Japan, eager to present itself as modern to Western powers, began reshaping its laws and morals to fit imported ideas. And in that process, centuries of open acknowledgement were swept under the rug. The Meiji government wanted recognition from Europe, especially after centuries of isolation. To be seen as civilized, they adopted Western legal codes and moral frameworks. Among those imports came a new view of sexuality, shaped by Victorian standards of modesty. Relationships between men, once folded naturally into samurai and monastic life, were now framed as improper. The same society that once celebrated tales of loyalty and love between warriors began censoring them. This wasn't just theory. Laws were written. In 1873, Japan briefly introduced a ban on sodomy under its new penal code, directly influenced by European models. Though the specific law didn't last long, its effect lingered. The practice became taboo, erased from public discourse. Poems once copied in schools were quietly dropped. Paintings and prints that had circulated freely were hidden away in collections. What had been part of the cultural fabric was suddenly treated like a stain. Real people felt this shift. Samurai traditions themselves were already fading swords, banned feudal domains abolished. And with that collapse came the silencing of the emotional bonds tied to them. Mori Ranmaru, once remembered as the loyal companion of Oda Nobunaga, became just a footnote stripped of context. Stories that Ihara Saikaku had made famous were pushed aside as embarrassing relics. It's striking to imagine the contrast. For hundreds of years, Japan saw no contradiction in warriors writing love poems to one another. Then almost overnight, that history was rebranded as shameful under foreign influence. If you've ever seen someone scrub a wall to erase graffiti only to leave behind a faint shadow of the words, you know what this erasure felt like. The outlines were still there, but the color was gone. And yet, even in this shadow, traces survived. Old woodblock prints weren't all destroyed. Some collectors quietly kept them. Libraries still held Saikaku stories, even if they weren't displayed. Temple records remained in dusty corners. The Meiji push for modernization couldn't fully erase centuries of human bonds. It only pressed them underground. You can almost picture the Japan of the 1880s gas lamps lighting the streets, men in bowler hats mixing with samurai descendants, now forced to wear suits. Outwardly it looked westernized. Inwardly, the old stories still whispered in corners. That tension between what was remembered and what was silenced marks one of the strangest turns in the story. What if the samurai's hidden verses and painted scrolls never really vanished, but kept echoing into the present? You sit in modern Japan, neon lights flickering outside, bullet trains rushing past, and yet somewhere in a museum drawer lies a fragile, woodblock print of two men in an embrace, or a poem written by a warrior to his companion. The voices aren't gone. They're waiting to be heard again. Today, scholars and activists are uncovering what the Meiji era tried to erase. They point out that Japan once had centuries where same-sex love wasn't whispered in shame, but woven into daily life. Think of Ihara Saikaku's Nanshoku Okagami, once popular reading now reprinted and studied in universities. Think of Nobunaga and Mori Ranmaru, once remembered only as lord and attendant, now recognized as something more complex, more human. These rediscoveries give depth to a history too often flattened by imported morality. And the influence lingers in subtle ways. Kabuki theater still thrives with actors who carry on the tradition of bending gender roles on stage. Modern manga and anime sometimes echo the themes of Nanshoku, exploring fluid identities and deep male bonds. Even contemporary art exhibitions revisit shunga, displaying it not as scandal, but as cultural heritage. What was once suppressed is slowly finding daylight again. For many in Japan today, the story is personal. Activists working for LGBTQ+ rights often remind the public that acceptance isn't something new being imported. It has roots in the country's own past. When a samurai wrote to his beloved with the same brush he used to copy battle plans, he left proof that identity and love were always part of the Japanese story. You think back to those temple courtyards, kabuki stages, and scrolls tucked into lacquer chests. None of them were accidents. They were people carving out space for affection in a world of duty and war. And though reformers and laws tried to silence them, the echoes still reach you now. So, as you close your eyes, imagine a samurai at dusk, armor set aside, brush in hand. He writes not about conquest, but about longing. He seals the letter, knowing it may never reach the one he loves. And yet somehow, across centuries, it has reached you. For centuries, samurai Japan carried stories that went beyond swords and battlefields. Behind the armor lay verses, paintings, and traditions like Nanshoku, where bonds between men were openly tied to loyalty, discipline, and even art. Figures like Oda Nobunaga and Mori Ranmaru remind us that honor and affection often walk side by side. Yet history later tried to erase these voices only for them to echo again today. And from those echoes, another truth emerges: the secret lives of samurai and their unyielding codes of honor. You hear it before you see it. Wooden clappers knocking in the night, echoing down the narrow lanes of Edo, like the world's most underwhelming drum solo. That's the sound of the samurai patrol making its rounds, lanterns swaying sandals, whispering against the packed dirt. You slip into their line, the straw straps cutting just a little too sharp against your bare heels, and suddenly you're part of a scene that would look oddly familiar to anyone who's ever walked home at 3 a.m. while the streetlights hum overhead. The difference: instead of neon buzzing, you've got oil lamps flickering in wooden frames, and instead of cops with radios, you've got sword-bearing samurai quietly humming with the weight of duty. The smell in the air is a cocktail of smoked soy and something you'd politely call city musk. Edo wasn't exactly famous for its sanitation, so patrols weren't just about catching thieves or putting out fires. They were about reassuring people that order still existed amid the stink and shadows. Imagine the comfort of hearing clogs and armor plates creak outside your paper-thin walls. It's like knowing there's a night guard at the mall, except this one could slice a charging horse in half, at least according to the legends. Do you believe those stories, or do you suspect the samurai enjoyed exaggerating just a bit over their sake cups? You keep pace, noticing how the patrol rarely talks. Silence itself is part of the performance. These men are symbols as much as they are guards. The armor gleams faintly, even in the dim glow, their hair tied in top knots, that silhouette like antennae tuned to every whisper. And yet, if you look closely, you notice tired eyes and stiff shoulders. Some of these samurai are bored. Some are hungry. A few might be calculating how much rice stipend is left at home. Honor has a sound, yes, but it also has a price tag. You wouldn't expect budgeting to be part of Bushido, but here it is, baked into every slow step. Lantern light paints strange shadows on the wooden shop fronts, the sliding shutters closed tight. You pass a sake house that smells more alive than it looks, drunken laughter rattling through bamboo walls, someone singing off-key. The patrol pretends not to hear, which is a kind of discipline in itself. Samurai weren't supposed to stumble in and demand free drinks, at least not while on duty. Yet history tells us plenty did. The strictness of the code was often balanced by the very human urge to bend it. Ever heard of Matsudera Sadanobu? He was a senior shogunate official in the 18th century who cracked down on waste and indulgence among samurai, reminding them that honor was about restraint, not bar tabs. You can almost feel his ghost shaking his head as you walk past this rowdy corner. The streets here are so dark that your own shadow feels like it's sneaking up behind you. No street lamps, no glow of phone screens, just lanterns held high. You realize how fragile safety feels. In a city that could burn down from a single tipped candle, samurai on patrol doubled as firefighters. That clapper sound wasn't just for thieves, it was an alarm for fire. Imagine the panic when a watchman's cry ripped through the night, Kaji da fire. In a heartbeat, samurai turned from silent symbols to frantic bucket passers sprinting toward flames with a courage that had nothing to do with duels. Honor wasn't just measured in how you fought, but how quickly you threw water on your neighbor's burning roof. One samurai in the group coughs, tugging at his collar. You notice the weight of his swords. Two of them, always two. The daisho set long and short, gleaming under cloth wrappings. To wear both wasn't just a fashion choice. It was the badge of his class. You might imagine it as the samurai version of a badge and sidearms, something that marked you instantly. And yes, there were strict rules about how to carry them, how to place them in front of you when sitting down. Even here, strolling through alleys, the swords are not just tools of violence, but reminders of identity. You might wonder, do they feel comforting? Or are they heavy burdens strapped to the body? The patrol turns down a narrower lane where a lone paper lantern swings above a door. Inside, someone whispers, a baby cries. You think about how ordinary life pressed right against this rigid system of honor. Samurai walk by with blades, but most of their nights were filled not with duels, but with checking locks, calming drunks, and making sure people got through until dawn. Does that surprise you? You've probably imagined samurai life as non-stop sword fights under cherry blossoms. Reality was closer to long shifts, cold nights, and paperwork waiting back at headquarters. You stumble slightly on a loose stone, catching yourself before you knock into the man ahead. He doesn't turn, but you feel his awareness sharpen. Samurai were trained to read the world in tiny shifts, the scrape of a shoe, the tremor of a voice. Imagine living like that every single day, a perpetual state of alertness. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Like being stuck forever in that half-awake state when you hear a creak in your own hallway at night and wonder, is that the wind or something else? Another corner, another pause. The patrol leader raises his lantern, checking the beam against the gate. No trouble. The group moves on. And you notice something striking. This honor code, this Bushido people romanticize, isn't carved in marble here. It's lived in each step, each small choice. Stay silent. Keep moving. Look steady, even if your stomach growls. The secret of the samurai isn't in the clash of steel, but in the discipline of doing this night after night without complaint. Morning nudges you awake with a chill on the tatami and the low rasp of brooms on straw. You pad across the floor in bare feet, the fibers biting softly, and the dojo smells like cypress old sweat and the faint sweetness of oil rubbed into wooden swords. Before any swing, before any grand talk of Bushido, you do the most unromantic thing. You clean. You push dust toward the door with the other's sleeves rolled, breath slow. The rule is simple. If you train here, you care for here. In a world that praises grand duels, the code begins with chores, and you can feel how that resets your posture, rubbing ego down to a low, useful shine. You face the shrine shelf, the kamiza, and line up with the group. Knees touch down, seiza, and your spine grows tall like a bamboo pole that learned manners. Someone calls Shomen ni rei. You bow to the front. Sensei ni rei. You bow again, eyes soft, not glued to the floor, not darting like a nervous sparrow. Bowing isn't drama, it's calibration. You're telling your body, less noise, more attention. Ever notice how a tiny ritual can flip your brain from hurry to focus faster than any motivational speech? This is that switch, and it's wired through your knees and neck. Mokuso eyes half-lidded breath low in the belly. You listen for the sound that isn't there, the wooden clappers of last night's patrol. Instead, You hear your own heartbeat, calm to a metronome. 10, 20, perhaps 30 breaths, and a stillness spreads that feels like black ink cooling on paper. When the clap comes, this time from the instructor's hands, you open your eyes, and the room looks sharper. It's not mysticism. It's a reset button disguised as quiet. Kihon, first fundamentals. You pick up a bakken, the wooden stand-in for a sword, and it's heavier than it looks, with a grain that catches the palm, just enough to remind you where pressure should live. Hands slide to the suka, with a Goldilocks grip, not too tight, not too loose. Wrists unlocked, elbows, soft shoulders down. The first 10 cuts feel like you're drawing lines in air. The next 10 start to hum in your shoulder sockets. By the 50th, your back is negotiating with your pride. The rhythm is hypnotic step cut exhale. Step cut exhale. 1,000 versions of the same note until suddenly the note begins to sing. Your teacher drifts behind like a sober ghost. He nudges your right thumb. A hair's breadth taps the outside of your knee with the flat of his fan. Says almost nothing. The smaller the correction, the bigger the change. You realize a code isn't learned by memorizing rules, but by moving through tiny, precise constraints until habit replaces debate. Have you ever adjusted a camera lens a fraction and the whole world popped into focus? That etiquette threads through everything. When you sit, your sword lies where it's hardest to grab in a hurry. A subtle promise you're not here to start trouble. When you pass someone, your blade side stays away. When you kneel to tie your hakama, you angle your body so no one sees you huff and puff. It's not fake. It's considerate. The dojo is a world where people trust you with wood that could crack ribs and steel that can end stories. Politeness is protective gear you can wear all day. Kata necks the codified duet with an invisible partner. You raise the bakken step forward and carve the air along a script older than your great-grandparents' great-grandparents. The moves travel like remembered lyrics, draw, cut, control. Recover, each linked to a slice of battlefield wisdom. The room fills with quiet footfalls and the soft thud of swords meeting padded targets. Your breath syncs with the steps, and almost against your will you begin to smile. Repetition gets a bad reputation, but in a dojo, it's the map from clumsy to clean. Across the room, 2 senior students take up spears' long leaf-shaped heads stitched in cloth sojutsu. They move like a call and response choir, one thrusting high, the other parrying low hands sliding on the shaft in a rhythm that looks like rowing a boat through fast water. A few tatami mats away, a pair, in short swords, work the close-knit grammar of jujutsu throws, locks, controlled pins. It's not a menu of cool tricks. It's one language with many dialects, and you're learning to order more than tea. A whispered name surfaces as you drill Yagyu Munenori, fencing master to the shogun who wrote about killing the spirit of confusion rather than the person in front of you. You imagine his fan tapping your wrist as he murmurs that the best cut is the one you never have to make. The idea sounds lofty until you feel it land in your forearm. Good posture discourages bad decisions. Better alignment equals fewer accidents. The abstract turns practical as soon as a partner's wooden tip stops an inch from your throat and you realize your chin had drifted up proud and silly. You switch to I, the draw-cut return of the sword from the scabbard. Kneel, tilt, slide, flash, and the blade would be out if it were real. Nuki tsuke, that decisive first cut. Then nodo, the quiet resheathing that's like threading a needle without looking. Every stage demands attention. Do you rush the draw and skip the angle? The imaginary opponent survives to scold you later. Do you fumble the return and nick the scabbard? In real life, you just paid money to ruin your own property. Very motivating. The slow parts teach more than the fast ones, and that's annoying until it's comforting. Senpai Kohai. Older and younger students organize the room's gravity. A senpai doesn't bark. He demonstrates. A kohai doesn't pout. She copies and asks clean questions. If you nail a sequence, you get a nod no one else sees. If you mess up royally, you get the same nod with a tiny extra pause, and somehow it feels like a second chance wrapped in a warning. You learn that hierarchy can be a soft ladder, not a boot. How different would office life be if promotions came with quiet responsibility instead of louder chairs mid-morning slides in? The door stands open, light scoring the dust like floating rice husks. You swap the boken for a shinai bamboo slats bound together for partnered drills with more speed. The protective gear, in some schools, looks like a cross between a knight's visor and a beekeeper's dream. And when the call comes, men for a head strike, you move in with a shout that empties your lungs of hesitation. Timing beats power. Posture beats flail. When you do it right, the bamboo whispers a good note. When you do it wrong, it coughs. Between rounds, you practice reiho, the choreography of respect. You approach bow at the right depth for the relationship, not too shallow, not too theatrical. You present the blade angle so the other person doesn't feel hunted. Words or small gestures are clear. The code isn't trying to turn you into a statue. It's trying to keep every interaction safer than it looks. Would road rage exist if every car had to bow before merging? It's a ridiculous thought until you imagine traffic moving with the same give and take you feel here. You drink water that tastes faintly of wood from the ladle and stretch the calves that pretended they weren't on fire. Someone's knuckles are purpling. Someone else smiles through a split lip that isn't heroic, just instructive. The dojo wall holds a rack of swords with lacquered scabbards that catch light like calm ponds. You remember last night's patrol, the weight of the daisho, the steady silence, and feel how this room and those streets form a loop. Patrol discipline, without body discipline, is just stomping around with lanterns. Body discipline, without social duty, is dancing alone with a sword. The two instruct each other. Your teacher has you repeat the first cut again, then again. You adjust your left foot by a whisper, and like magic, the strike lands true without more effort. He smiles one eye width and turns away. The correction was a few grains of rice. The difference fills a bowl. The body keeps the receipt. Later, when your temper tries to sprint, your shoulders will remember to drop. When fear tries to rise, your breath will slide low on its own. Bushido isn't a museum plaque. It's the groove you've carved with 1,000 harmless cuts that keep worse cuts from ever happening. Class bows out. You wipe sweat with the sleeve you swore you'd keep clean, and you sweep again, because that's how cycles close in this place. The tatami sigh under the broom, and the room gives you back your own reflection. Straighter. Now, quieter at the edges, a little more precise with how you hold the weight of being someone others must trust. You count your income, not in coins, but in bowls, each one filled with imaginary rice that you can almost smell, steaming on a winter morning. One koku, about what one person eats in a year, sits like a tidy mountain on your mental ledger. In the shogunate, defines your worth by how tall that mountain is. You repeat the number. The clerk recites, feel the weight of a stipend you won't ever actually see as grain, because most of it detours through warehouses, brokers, and obligations before your chopsticks get near it. At the Kura storehouse, the stacks breathe quietly in the dark, and your name becomes a wooden tag tied to a pile that will never fit in your sleeves. You sign bow and step back, as rice brokers take over their abacuses rattling like cicadas as they turn your koku into cash at a rate that changes with rumors weather. And whether a daimyo just threw a too fancy procession on the highway, the brokers talk Osaka prices, dojima, exchange, futures contracts, clever enough to make your head tilt, and you nod as if all this arithmetic is just another kata. You watch a man in plain cotton make the largest moves in the room, and it's not a samurai. It's a merchant whose pens can lift or drop your week. In another age, swords decided things. In Edo, interest does. You remember last night's patrol and this morning's bows, and you realize the third pillar is here among ink stains and tally cords, because an honor code that ignores money is a play performed without a stage. Your stipend arrives with strings, and the first ones are family retainers, and the constant nibble of house repairs. The wind insists on scheduling. Then, the wardrobe list, 2 outfits, respectable enough for official calls, a set of hakama for training sandals that won't betray your heel at the worst step. You pause at sword maintenance. The blades are family members and hungry ones, their scabbards needing lacquer, their ray skin and silk wraps needing an artisan's patience that never comes cheap. In the sword district, you haggle without looking like you're haggling, because the performance of politeness is part of the price. A fittings maker lays out tsuba guard plates like small moons, iron etched with waves. Cranes, or that discreet clan emblem you can afford this year. You weigh a cheaper iron piece against a shakudo alloy that drinks light like ink, and you feel the tug of both prudence and pride while your thumb tests the edge of craft more than the edge of war. You remember hearing that Miyamoto Musashi carved his own wooden practice swords, painted, sketched, and accepted patronage that paid partly in quiet rooms to think. The story settles into your budgeting as a permission slip. A warrior does art because art is how a warrior keeps his balance. You look back at your dwindling purse and pick the practical tsuba, promising yourself the nicer one when next year's rice doesn't drown in roof leaks. Your domain posts notices about frugality. You've seen versions of these sermons before. Tokugawa Yoshimune's Kyoho reforms urged thrift. Later, Matsudera Sadanobu's Kensei reforms scolded indulgence with the patience of a tired parent. The message filters down to you as a small, daily discipline. Fewer parties, more mending. Make that tea bowl last. Through one more season, keep the lantern oil to the safe line instead of the showy line. You line up your incoming koku against outgoing obligations and feel the math pinch in a place the dojo never warned you about. Sanken Kotai, the daimyo's alternate attendance in Edo, looks dramatic on the road with banners and palanquins, but someone pays for every footstep, and that someone is the ledger that trickles into your pocket. When your lord travels, your household tightens because rice has a way of dissolving under ceremonial heat. You stop by a pawnbroker's shop with the innocuous sign of 3 circles and a polite clerk who knows everyone's secret calendar. Here, a low-ranking cousin trades a short blade for cash to bridge this month's gap and promises to redeem it when the harvest settles prices. You don't judge. The code you live is sharper than the code you quote, and the city's true anthem is the soft jingle of items leaving and returning behind paper screens. You pick up a side class to teach writing a few coins for showing a merchant's son how to hold a brush so the stroke lands like a clean cut. Another night, you demonstrate basic spear forms to a group of town guards who need posture more than poetry, and you take your pay in an envelope that feels lighter than your cabs. Side work isn't a shame. It's the seam that keeps the robe together, and plenty of samurai do it, while the storytellers pretend otherwise. A friend in the magistrate's office, Yoriki ranks sleeves ink-stained sighs over a stack of incident notes and whispers that bureaucracy is a battlefield with no banners. He collects a stipend similar to yours and spends half his life reminding people to file things in the right box so justice can find them later. You envy his indoor shoes during rainy season and pity his hours, and the comparison makes your own numbers stand straighter. You receive a gift at mid-year Osebo from a merchant you helped with a letter of introduction, and etiquette turns the parcel into an equation. Accepting obligates you to act with fairness the next time his name crosses your desk, not as a bribe, but as a social stitch on the debt of gratitude that arranges people into net rather than piles. You log the gift with neat brushstrokes, the way you log a kata, not dramatic, just necessary. On the street, a storyteller recites the wealth of Kaga, the 1 million koku of the Maeda domain, and children's eyes widen at numbers bigger than castles. You chuckle because big numbers make nice songs while most of the city lives in the small arithmetic of sandals miso and school fees. You keep walking because the rice broker's note in your sleeve says the rate may drop this afternoon, if the rumor about coastal storms proves true. At a tea house you can afford exactly once this month, you meet a sword polisher whose fingers are permanently scented with oil and stone. He speaks of edges like a baker speaks of crusts, and he tells you an unbalanced life chips a blade faster than poor steel. You listen because you paid for this cup, and you want to extract wisdom per copper, but also because his metaphor fits the way your days spool out between patrol practice and payments. You test the fit of your scabbard's mouth. The koiguchi, after the lacquerer, returns it, and the silent glide of the blade says the money was justified. In IAI practice, a rough mouth snags the draw, and a snag multiplies into a flinch you can't afford. You jot the cost in the household book, tally it against fewer sweets for the little ones, and you shut the book before it asks you whether honor tastes like sugar or like patience. A kabuki actor passes the corner with painted eyes and a retinue that looks like a small parade carrying poems. The merchant sponsoring him laugh with sleeves politely over mouths, and you note the way art money and status braid without asking soldiers for permission. You wonder if your son will choose a brush, a ledger, or a blade. You wonder if the city will decide for him by the time the next reform edict arrives. The rice broker keeps a small bell for price shifts, 1 ring for a rumor, 2 for confirmation, 3 for the kind of news that makes people jog. You hear 1 ring and nobody moves. 2 rings and sleeves ripple. 3 rings and the room breathes in at once. Today it's 2, and you trade a portion before the crowd tests the floorboards trying to catch the better wind without looking like you chase it. A scroll on your shelf carries Yagyu Munenori's line about life-giving sword, and you smile at its quiet economics, spend your energy where it prevents harm rather than buys glory. It reads like a budget, written in metaphor, and you find yourself applying it to candles visits in the distance you keep from people who love to borrow. You sharpen your day the way the polisher sharpens your blade, removing what does not help the cut. At home, your wife rewrites the spending list with a calm precision that humbles the warrior persona you hang by the door with your coat. She notes the price of charcoal, the timing of soy deliveries, the neighbor who sells good radishes if you arrive before dawn. Her numbers are the quiet rhythm that lets your public composure exist, and you begin to see the household as the scabbard that lets the sword travel without injury. A letter arrives stamped with your lord's seal, and you half expect a ceremonial expense disguised as an opportunity. You have a cloak for such days, plain but neat, and a mindset that translates honor into show up on time with the correct receipts. You slip the letter into your sleeve near the rice broker's chit. 2 papers that smell faintly of different kinds of power, and you walk toward evening with the sense that tonight's patrol will feel steadier because the ledger for now balances. Your hands calm first, then your breath, as the tea room asks you to become smaller than your worries. The entrance is low by design, so you slide in on your knees and leave rank quarrels and street noise outside like muddy sandals at the threshold. The straw tatami presses a hush into your skin. Lantern light falls like warm rain on the lacquered ladle, and even your shoulders. Those stubborn guards drop their spears and stand easy. The room says almost nothing, and somehow tells you everything. A hanging scroll holds 1 spare character that feels like a gentle finger to your lips. The flower arrangement is not a bouquet, more a single syllable set upright in a rustic vase. You catch yourself correcting your posture as if the camellia might be keeping attendance. You've spent nights keeping order with clappers and steel. Here, order keeps you with paper walls and steam. Charcoal service begins sumi demes. Coals, set with deliberate angles, so heat becomes a measured sentence, not a shout. The host folds a fukusa silk square, with the kind of geometry you secretly wish your accounts had, each crease meeting without argument. The whisk, chasten, rests like a curled fern. Implements line up with the quiet authority you remember from a well-run drill. Nothing wasted, nothing random. Everything in its small right place. Water sighs into the iron kettle. The lid clicks back, the soft confidence of a practiced draw. You think of Takun Soho, the Zen monk, who advised swordsmen to keep the mind unfettered, not stuck to fear, not glued to pride. The steam lifts, and you find your gaze doing exactly what he recommended, noticing, then moving on. The bowl arrives with two hands, always two, and you receive it like a favor you did not deserve, but will try to be worthy of turning it a quarter so the honored side faces away. Etiquette isn't a prison here. It's a handrail. You whisk, froth, gathers like a small weather system, and your forearms remember the dojo's rhythm pressure from the wrists, not the shoulders, speed from the fingers, not the jaw. You could call this training wheels for presence, but that would be rude in a room this patient. You take a sip. The taste lands between bitter and green, not fighting you, simply insisting that you show up. You do, and the world gets larger inside a bowl the size of your palm. It strikes you how much of a samurai's calm is an environmental decision. The tea room is tiny, 2-4, maybe 6 tatami, but it expands you by shrinking everything else. The garden path you walked in on the roji, the dew path, already did half the work with stepping stones forcing shorter strides and softer eyes. In another life, you might call this UX design. Here, it is hospitality that shepherds your nerves toward a gate only stillness can open. Sen no Rikyu's shadow is here, too. The tea master, who pared beauty down until pride couldn't find a perch. He preferred a rough tea bowl with one sincere curve over a glittering trophy cup that begged for compliments. You're beginning to see why. A warrior spends so many hours seeing threats, angles exits, that he must also practice seeing less. Just this bowl, this steam, this breath that loosens the knot between ribs. Do you notice your jaw unclench? It's like discovering a room inside a room. It's easy to treat tea as decoration, like a screensaver for nerves, but your body understands the deeper contract. Bushido, without a brake pedal, is just a handsome collision. This space supplies the pedal. You hear faint traffic of the neighborhood beyond the paper vendors, a laugh, the wooden thock of a distant pestle, and each sound seems politely filtered through the kettle. In the dojo, you learned that a clean cut starts in the feet. Here, you learn that a clean decision starts in a quiet bowl. The host places sweets, higashi, beside you, pressed sugar shapes that dissolve like rehearsal for goodbyes. You time the bite before the tea, so bitter and sweet, negotiate rather than fight a lesson your tongue files under conflict resolution. If only street disputes arrived sugar-dusted and scheduled. Still, you store the principle: balance first, verdict second. Conversation is sparse and good-humored. A guest mentions a temple bell that cracked last winter. Someone wonders if the frost found the bell's hidden seam. You think of your own seam's impatience at the market queue, the way a careless word can rattle a whole morning, and you feel a decision settle sand to the seam. Not by force, by routine, by more visits to this tiny republic of measured gestures where nobody raises a voice and everything speaks plainly. You remember Yagyu Munenori's life-giving sword? A phrase that sounded like poetry when you first heard it in a smoky back room. Tonight, it feels like logistics. If your purpose is to prevent harm more than to cause it, then you must maintain the internal conditions where prevention is possible. Tea is not a luxury. It's maintenance, like oil on the blade. Like checking your sandals before a night patrol so the heel strap doesn't betray you at a sprint. The host refreshes coals. The kettle answers with that small, contented murmur you'd trust to babysit your worries. A breeze folds through the shoji screens, bringing the faintest scent of pine resin. The scroll's character seems to breathe with you. Zen teachers would probably clap once and call the lesson complete. You're a practical person, so you file the moment under repeatable protocols. You don't need enlightenment, you need reliability. This room is engineered reliability disguised as grace. A modern aside sneaks in. If office meetings were conducted with this level of intention, would anyone need a second meeting about the first meeting? Tea ceremony doesn't ask for new rules. It asks for fewer moves done better. You glance at your hands rough from bamboo sword grip, and suddenly the whisk feels like a cousin of the shinai. Both teach you to apply force without noise. Someone asks a simple question. Have you ever watched water boil and not gotten bored and the room laughs softly? It's the kind of laughter that floats, not the kind that jabs. You watch the tiny bubbles collect and release around the kettle's edge, the way worry collects and releases around a day. The rhythm is patient. You step into it like a shallow stream. A servant slides the door open to replace an ash dish, and you notice how she keeps her steps beneath the conversation's surface like a fish moving under ripples. The discipline isn't theatrical. It prevents collisions. The thought joins your mental kit. How many accidents in alleys and offices are just bad timing with loud feet? Here, even footsteps keep to the code. Outside, a wooden clapper sounds in the distance. One tap, then two. The kind that once pulled you into a run. Tonight, it becomes part of the kettle's song. Tea doesn't erase danger. It resets your reaction speed so you choose rather than flinch. You picture taking this steadiness back onto the streets. The drunk you guide home without bruising his pride. The fire you spot as a candle's whisper, not an alarm scream. The quarrel you untie with a phrase that lands like a bow, not a shove. Before you leave, you bow to the alcove. The camellia bows back in the polite language of stems. You're not a different person than when you arrived. You're the same person tuned. You track the rosy stones with slower eyes, rejoining the world at a speed the world can survive. The night air tastes cooler, as if the city took a neat sip of its own tea. You slide the door closed and let the latch find its home with a small click that feels like a promise you might actually keep the kettle on inside even when the street clappers call you out. Keep the seam sanded. Keep the breath low. Keep the bowl simple enough that your pride can't find a chair. You step onto the lane, the lanterns glow steady in your hand, and the calm travels with you, as if it had always been yours, merely waiting for you to notice. The calm you carry from the tea room takes you into rooms where promises sit heavier than armor. You kneel on tatami facing a low writing desk brush wet with black and copy a kishaman oath so formal it almost sounds supernatural. You write your name beneath a vow to serve, to keep secrets, to accept punishment. If you ever bend the line and the closing clause calls down divine witnesses with the politeness of a thundercloud, some houses add a keppen. A fingertip pricked and a dot of red touched to the page because ink is persuasive, but blood has better handwriting when it comes to memory. Sake waits in small cups. You and your counterpart, maybe a fellow retainer, maybe your junior, lift them together in a Sakazuki exchange, the slow choreography that turns colleagues into kin. The room breathes with witnesses who pretend not to listen, and the cups make a soft kiss against ceramic that sounds like a contract finding its home. People later will claim brotherhood is a feeling. In this world, it is also a protocol, and the protocol works because it gives feelings something sturdy to ride on. There is the big oath to lord and house, but the daily ones are quieter. You promise to show up to tell the truth, even when wrapped in politeness, to remove your sword when it rattles the room's trust. Mentorship sits in the middle, half oath, half education. Your senpai corrects your foot angle and in the same breath shows you how to fold shame so it fits in a sleeve instead of exploding in the yard. You, in turn, take a bright-eyed kohai, fishing at dawn, and sneak in a lesson about ledger pages between stories about carp. The code expands through small acts that don't need a registrar. And then there are affections, the kind that don't fit neatly on the scroll, but are carved into the life around it. In samurai circles, bonds between men often carry layers, teacher and student, elder and junior, friends walking lockstep inside the same risk. Edo people had names for this Nanshoku Shudo, words too often flattened by outsiders into a single note when the melody is what mattered. Loyalty, mentorship, tenderness, managed with discretion. You keep it PG in public because public is a place with ears, and you let sincerity live in poems, glances, in the steady presence of someone who knows your breath by its footsteps. A real example walks through your memory. Oda Nobunaga and Mori Ranmaru. Officially, Ranmaru is the young page whose devotion borders on luminous. Practically, he is the person who knows how the Lord likes his armor tied, and which silences mean leave me versus stay. Stories say their bond was deep, the kind that makes a teenager die at Honoji without a second thought when the temple flames go up around his lord. You don't need to argue the romantic label to respect the loyalty. The result is the same devotion that doesn't ask for an audience. Another pair, the city whispers about Takeda Shingen and Kosaka Masanobu, strategist and retainer, two minds folded together around the same problem: how to keep Kai province standing when the world tilts. Letters survive, with a warmth that reads like the edge of confidence and care. You read them as a reminder that a warlord's most important weapon may be someone who can tell him no without losing the room. Affection here is infrastructure. It keeps tempers from spending the army in one afternoon. You're not naive about the frictions. Oaths can tug against oaths, like tides colliding lord versus friend. Family versus house law, promise to mentor versus command to punish. Giri and ninjo duty and human feeling square off under your ribs more often than steel does in the alley. You recall a magistrate's assistant, sleeves inked dark, who failed to speak up for his brother-in-arms during an investigation because the paperwork demanded neutrality. He spent a year obeying perfectly and sleeping hardly at all. The code asks you to choose, and sometimes choosing is simply agreeing to carry the remainder. Discretion is its own art. You learn to speak in threads, not ropes. A friend's reputation phrase. You pull the loose ends into your sleeve rather than snapping them in public. You write a poem whose season word, snow plum tide, says more than any speech would, and you pass it folded like a small roof. In another century, people will call this reading between the lines. In yours, it's basic safety. Have you ever texted a half sentence because a full one would start a fire? Same principle. different paper. Even the training halls make space for these layers. A Ryu grants Menkyo licenses not only for skill, but for judgment. And judgment includes how you hold another person's story. You spar with someone you care about, and your strikes become clearer rather than kinder. You respect them enough not to lie with your blade. Afterward, you wrap their bruised forearm with the competence of a field medic, and the silence between you feels like a promise not to waste each other's time. The home reinforces what the oath begins. Your wife notices you returning late and slides a second bowl of rice across without complaint, because she knows whose door you sat beside for 2 hours to keep him from making the kind of mistake that ruins 3 families. She says nothing about the lateness and everything in the way she tops up your tea. Affection is often logistics performed without a receipt. Disputes happen. Feelings complicate chains of command. You remember a senior retainer whose sworn brother borrowed favors like air and forgot to pay either back. The house found out not because someone shouted, but because the ledger started to limp. The correction was household-level reassignment, not spectacle. You took notes. Loyalty is not an excuse for sloppy math. It's a reason to keep the math clean, so loyalty can survive scrutiny. When you escort a kabuki troupe through a checkpoint, you catch an Onagata male actor playing female roles, sharing a conspiratorial grin with a samurai in travel dress. You don't pry. The city runs on unspoken agreements. People are allowed to be complex as long as they are also careful. Your job is not to punish warmth, but to ensure warmth doesn't melt the rules that keep midnight from catching fire. A quieter affection lives within mentorship. You show a junior how to compose a refusal that feels like a bow rather than a door slam. How to turn an invitation down with gratitude and a substitute favor. How to keep boundaries like garden hedges soft to the eye, sharp to the touch. When he gets it right, you give him the smallest nod. When he misreads a room, you meet him at the corner shrine and fix the damage before anyone has to write about it in a report. Discipline isn't always punishment. Often it's coaching under lantern light. Do oaths ever ask too much? You carry an old story of a retainer who followed his friend into a vendetta and left his lord short-handed during a flood. The village did not care that he was noble. It cared that the rice fields drowned. The house reprimand was surgical. Restore the fields first, then resolve the vendetta through law, not knives. The lesson hardened in you. A good promise includes the community, or it isn't good yet. On festival nights, bonds breathe easier. You trade cups with men who would wrestle a boar for you, and you note how laughter acts like a pressure valve for households that run on poise. You keep your drink slow, because stories leak when cups move fast. The lanterns paint everyone almost beautiful, and you store that image for the mornings when fatigue makes faces look like letters. Every so often, the city tests your discretion with gossip you could profit from. You let it pass, not because you are a saint, but because you like sleeping. Peace of mind is the interest paid by a policy of minding your own business. A modern analogy would be a non-disclosure agreement. Yours just lives in your bones rather than in a folder. Do you break it for attention, not if you want attention tomorrow? You write one more oath tonight, a small one only you will ever read. Continue to protect what's human in the people who wear this uniform, including yourself. You don't frame it or announce it. You put it into the way you close a door gently, the way you fold a letter, the way you stand between a rumor and a person's livelihood, like a well-placed screen in a tea room. The great code depends on 1,000 small human ones, and you are fluent enough now to speak them without moving your lips. The candle, guttering by your desk, throws a soft blade of light across the page. You press the brush to the stone for a last drop of ink, and the characters for your name settle into place with a steadiness that surprises you. You blow the flame out, not dramatically, just neatly, and you listen to the quiet to confirm the promise took. Somewhere, outside Sandals Pass, in the lane, a reminder that others are keeping watch. While you keep faith. You slide the oath into its sleeve and tie the cord with fingers that remember both sword grip and tea whisk, and you rise, knowing the bonds you maintain will hold through another dawn. You hold the scroll in your lap and let your eyes trail across lines of calligraphy that promise certainty with strokes of ink. The domain law lists what samurai must do: guard serve respect, die if commanded, and the house regulations narrow it further. How many retainers in procession? How much silk in a formal coat? Even the direction you bow when entering a superior's hall. It reads like an iron fence, but you've lived long enough to know fences are climbed bent and sometimes politely ignored. The official code, Bushido, the way of the warrior, never really sat as a single book on a shelf. It filtered through edicts, manuals, temple sermons, and family law codes that overlapped like rice paper screens. Yamaga Soko, the Confucian thinker, wrote that a samurai's role was moral exemplar, the one who shows the farmer how to be upright. You roll that phrase in your head while remembering the farmer who once taught you how to patch a leaky roof, and the balance feels less tidy. Codes tell stories. Daily life edits them. In practice, your patrol partner worries less about lofty morality than whether the lantern oil stretches until dawn. You recall a magistrate who ordered everyone to carry swords in a prescribed way. Edge up guard, tied with 2 loops. Yet half the men in the ward let straps fray, arguing it kept the draw smoother. Was that disobedience or practical wisdom? The line blurs, and the code survives because people quietly adjust it to keep it alive. Punishments exist for breaking form, and they can be stiff. A samurai, drunk in public, might find himself dismissed, or worse, compelled to perform seppuku to restore face. You shudder at the ceremony's formality, the way it turns a personal mistake into public theater. But equally, you've seen cases where rules bent rather than broke. A daimyo's son caught gambling might be scolded with poetry instead of steel, because preserving lineage mattered more than obeying a clause. Even codes carry loopholes written not in ink, but in priorities. Think of the famous 47 Ronin. Official law said no revenge. They ignored it, killed the man responsible for their lord's death, then turned themselves in. The shogunate hesitated, trapped between punishing lawbreakers and admiring their loyalty. The solution was tidy in logic, but messy in feeling order them to commit seppuku honorable death for dishonorable obedience. The tale became legend, but underneath it is a simple arithmetic. You feel every day codes are ideals until people press them with real grief. You remember a friend who served as Eureki under the city magistrate. He confessed over sake that half his job was paperwork designed to reconcile contradictory orders. One edict from the shogunate demanding frugality, another from the domain expecting lavish procession. He laughed at the absurdity. We save candles by day and waste them at night. His ledger looked ridiculous, but his life kept moving. And perhaps that is the truer shape of honor, to absorb contradictions without collapsing. The written codes often emphasize loyalty, but what happens when lords themselves wander? You know the story of Hosokawa Gracia, a Christian convert and wife of a daimyo who chose death rather than become a hostage in political conflict. Her decision bent the rule of female obedience into an act of autonomy, and the chronicles struggled to categorize it. Was it loyal, rebellious, holy? You notice how history preserves these edges. Proof that no code swallows individuality whole. In quieter rooms, manuals like the Hagakure whisper different advice. The way of the warrior is found in death. It sounds absolute until you hear the context. Yamamoto Tsunetmo wrote it as a retired retainer, nostalgic, and frustrated at softening standards. Many samurai kept breathing for decades after balancing budgets, tending gardens, teaching calligraphy. Did they dishonor the code by living? Or did they honor it better by making life sustainable? You sip your tea and suspect the answer lies in the gray. A merchant once asked you bluntly, if honor says you must fight, but profit says you must trade, which wins? You replied with a smile, whichever lets me buy rice tomorrow. It wasn't cynicism, it was survival. Merchants may have ranked lower in theory, but in the markets of Edo, they nudged samurai with silk cords invisible to law. The code did not predict this inversion, yet daily transactions bent the hierarchy into something less rigid, more lived. Etiquette manuals dictated that a samurai never show his back to a superior, yet you've seen veterans turn slightly when coughing, protecting the lord from spray. A breach or a kindness. The code said one thing, the body said another. Your own habits form a quieter creed. Obey the rule unless disobedience saves dignity for both sides. You've carried that into tea rooms, markets, and long silences on rainy guard shifts. A calligraphy teacher you once studied with explained that rules are like brush guides for beginners, necessary to teach control, but eventually the hand must flow freer or the ink dies stiff. You apply that to Bushido. The scrolls are guides. Life is the stroke. If every mark were identical, the paper would bore itself to ash. Variation within discipline. That's where vitality hides. Sometimes you question aloud how much of Bushido is reality and how much is a story told after the fact to make warriors look nobler than their debts. The room often goes silent because doubt itself feels like breaking rank. Yet you notice your peers doubt too. They just fold it into jokes or long pauses. Codes are like paper screens. They define space, but everyone knows how thin they are. At night, when you settle by the hearth, you recall the contradictions laws demanding death practices, favoring survival, ideals praising poverty, lives chasing side jobs. You stroke the scabbard of your blade and sense the irony. The weapon is absolute, yet its use is endlessly negotiable. So it is with Bushido. The edge is sharp, but the wielder decides whether to slice to parry or to keep the sword resting quietly where it belongs. Your pen hovers above the page, and you smile at the irony. Sometimes the sharpest blade in a samurai's life isn't steel at all, but the nib of a brush. A face can lie, but the shape of a character drawn with ink gives you away faster than a drunk stumble on patrol. A single poem can carry a message more dangerous than a duel, and you learn that in Edo, courtesy itself can be a form of armor. You bow to your superior, and the depth of that bow is a language. Too shallow, and you're insolent. Too deep, and you look desperate, maybe even mocking. You practice the perfect tilt, the way you once practiced Iae. Draws, half a heartbeat, neither rushed nor hesitant. Walking through the magistrate's hall feels like playing chess with your own spine. Every gesture must strike balance. You fought with bamboo swords, but here your weapons are the angle of your neck, the timing of a pause, the silence after yes, sir. Letters expand this world. A friend writes of rain on his province's rice paddies, but you know he's telling you that harvest's poor and tension's worse. Another writes of plum blossoms, but the season word signals loneliness more than petals. You scratch your own replies with careful brush strokes, hiding counsel inside weather reports, sending encouragement folded like paper lanterns. Imagine email threads today, where every subject line is a haiku, polite, indirect, but everyone reading knows the subtext. That was survival in paper form. Politeness can hide barbs sharper than blades. You've seen a senior retainer deliver an insult, wrapped in 10 layers of compliment so ornate it took an afternoon for the victim to realize he'd been cut. The trick wasn't cruelty, it was control. A loud insult draws swords. A veiled one lets everyone save face while still shifting the room's gravity. Have you ever replayed a conversation hours later and thought, wait, did they just roast me politely? That's Edo diplomacy at work. Masks are literal too. No theater draped expression in wood, so a tilt of the head conveyed joy, sorrow, rage. Samurai borrowed the trick. In court, your face must remain unreadable. The famed poker face centuries before casinos. But within feelings dance, you think of Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, who could sit like a carved statue through hours of counsel, letting allies guess his leanings. When he finally spoke, the few words carried the weight of silence hoarded like treasure. You test your own mask at a feast. A rival boasts of his lord's new garden lanterns, clearly meant to overshadow your own modest gifts. You laugh, softly nod, and reply with a poem about the moon-free light that no lantern can outshine. The room chuckles, and your rival bows as if complimented. Inside, you feel the small thrill of having landed a strike with paper instead of steel. That's the secret duel most samurai fought more often than any battlefield won. Sometimes masks protect kindness. You visit a fellow retainer whose stipend has shrunk, And instead of offering coins, a gesture that would humiliate him, you write a poem praising his frugal strength and discreetly arrange for a rice merchant to extend his credit. He accepts the poem, bows with gratitude, and the dignity remains intact. A rigid code might call this dishonesty. Lived, Bushido calls it mercy folded into etiquette. Yet there are dangers. Too much masking, too much politeness and sincerity drowns. You remember a colleague who bowed and agreed at every meeting, then quietly stewed until one day his anger cracked open in violence. His mask fooled the room, but betrayed himself. The lesson hangs clear. Courtesy should be a filter, not a dam. Even the strongest paper tears if the ink pools too long. Your brush returns to the page for another letter, this one to a friend transferred to Kyoto. You describe the spring mist, but what you really say is, I miss your company. You sketch a small crane in the corner, a symbol of resilience, but between you two, a private code for encouragement. The ink dries, and you realize that these hidden gestures keep friendships alive across miles in a way no proclamation could. Even humor has its mask. At a banquet, an older warrior tells a story of tripping over his own sword while rushing to greet his lord. The laughter is generous, but underneath the tale teaches juniors not to hurry their bows. Jokes become camouflaged manuals, and everyone leaves wiser while still smiling. In the alleyways, kabuki actors practice the same coded performance. Men play women's roles, reveal truths about men, and the audience learns to read layers. You find yourself borrowing their tricks, speaking truths through metaphors, softening refusals with wordplay. What looks like theater in a lantern-lit district becomes survival skill in the Lord's Council. And always the balanced sincerity must peek through, or else all this politeness turns to ash. You recall a night when a friend laid aside all ceremony, poured you sake with his bare hand, and said simply, "Don't go tomorrow. It's a trap." No bow, no poetry, just truth, raw and urgent. That single moment cut through all the masks and remains sharper in your memory than any duel. You roll up the letter you've just finished, press it closed with a cord, and breathe on the seal to soften the wax. The ink smudges faintly on your thumb, a reminder that words leave marks even when hidden. As you set it aside, you wonder which is more dangerous, the sword in your scabbard, or the poem that could shift an entire household's fate with 3 polite lines. The paper doors slide open, and the house exhales faint smells of miso and smoke, curling with the creak of floorboards that know every step. You've carried swords on patrol and drilled until your shoulders buzz. But here you cross into the quieter battlefield home where women's hands often steer the fate of men who pretend to command everything. Your wife kneels at the hearth sleeves, tied back, stoking coals with the same precision you used in kata. Her ledger lies open beside her characters, neat recording expenses. You rarely think about oilcloth rice school fees, temple donations. You may recite Bushido in council, but she enforces its survival with math. The code would collapse without these invisible calculations, yet no scroll praises household accountancy as way of the warrior. You smile at the thought. Perhaps it should. From the side alcove comes the soft thud of practice. Your daughter, barely taller than her naginata, thrusts with careful steps under the eye of her grandmother. Women of the Bushi class were not just bystanders. Onabu geisha trained guarded homes and sometimes led troops. Tomoe. Gozen still echoes through stories, her bow cutting down enemies at the Battle of Owazu in the 12th century, her courage sung in the Haika Monogatari. You imagine her spirit folded into these tatami as your daughter repeats the motion blade low arms steady. You think of the siege of Aizu centuries later when Nakano Takeko led a unit of women Joshigun into battle, her naginata flashing until her last breath. The official chronicles often relegate such figures to side notes, yet their choices stitch the same cloth as men's. Inside your own house, you see how easily history could miss these voices. The careful budgeting the naginata practice at dawn, the stern advice whispered before you leave for patrol. Daily power moves quieter than battles. A wife deciding which cousin to invite for the New Year's banquet might tilt alliances more effectively than your sword arm. A mother's letter to her brother in another domain could patch a quarrel long before steel rattles. You recall an elder who joked, "The shogun rules Japan, but my wife rules this house," and everyone laughed, because it was less a joke than a confession. Women maneuver inside etiquette as deftly as men do with swords. A well-timed tea offering during an argument, a subtle reminder about obligations, owed a whisper to a son about restraint. It all adds weight to choices that will later appear official. The code's written face insists men hold authority. The lived code reveals a household that breathes only when everyone takes a turn at the bellows. You remember visiting a comrade's home after he fell in service. His widow, face calm but eyes sharp, received guests, arranged memorial rites, negotiated stipends with officials who thought themselves clever. She bowed at the right depth, placed her words like stones in a stream, and walked away, having secured her children's future. You realize then that Bushido wasn't only carried in patrols and duels, it survived in how widows refused to let households sink. Even your own training owes a debt here. Your wife patches your hakama, so seams don't split mid-bow. She scolds you into eating when pride says skip. She listens when you mutter about contradictions between edicts, then quietly asks, what choice keeps tomorrow? Simplest. Her counsel isn't philosophy. It's logistics. And logistics is what lets philosophy stand upright. On festival nights, you notice the quiet strategy behind which lanterns she lights, which neighbors she compliments, which merchants she pays early. These gestures ripple farther than any decree. The merchant's son remembers kindness. The neighbor repeats her words with admiration. Your own name rises a notch because of courtesies you didn't even perform. Samurai pride talks of face, but much of that face is polished at home. The house itself whispers discipline. Paper doors, patched neatly tatami, aired in the sun garden, weeded even when you forget. The neatness is not vanity, it's social defense. Guests see order and assume the same of your character. You begin to understand that Bushido hides in broom bristles as much as in swords. Have you ever judged someone's reliability by their messy desk? Same instinct centuries older. You listen to the sound of your daughter's naginata striking a straw target. The rhythm is awkward, then steady, then awkward again. It mirrors your own training, but with laughter instead of groans. She shouts, "Ya!" and the echo carries through the house like a tiny drum beat of continuity. You wonder how many houses heard that same sound tucked away in alleys and mountain valleys, each one contributing threads to a fabric history nearly forgot. At night, your wife unrolls a sutra, chanting softly while the children drift toward sleep. You watch from the doorway, feeling that same blend of order and tenderness that tea once taught you. Honor isn't all patrols and oaths. It's this chant, this careful budgeting, this hidden training in rooms without banners. Codes of conduct may put men at the center, but households reveal the secret. Women kept the rhythm steady enough for codes to exist at all. You extinguish the lantern with a breath. Darkness settles, but not silence. From the garden comes the faint trickle of water in a stone basin, and from the alcove, the quiet scrape of your daughter storing her naginata. You realize your armor hangs peacefully by the wall, only because this house holds steady. The invisible scaffolding of Bushido is built from voices history often skips, but you've heard them tonight, and you trust them more than any proclamation nailed to a gate. The road crunches under your sandals, not with the steady rhythm of patrol, but with the uneven hunger of wandering. The crest has been cut from your sleeves, the rice stipend vanished like smoke, and the word Ronin follows you in whispers, masterless, drifting a blade without a scabbard. The city still watches samurai with wary eyes. But now, your presence carries less authority and more suspicion, as if the code of honor evaporated with your paycheck. You knock at a tea house offering bodyguard work, and the keeper looks you up and down, measuring whether your discipline outweighs your desperation. It's a negotiation. Every Ronin knows honor traded in half shifts, trust rented by the day. Some accept, some sneer, and you move on, sandals thinning. Bushido manuals speak of loyalty unto death, but they never wrote the appendix on what happens after your lord's household collapses, leaving you alive with debts and no banner. Hired swords become hired pens. You copy letters for merchants, mediate disputes for farmers. Sometimes stand outside a warehouse with arms folded to deter thieves, more with posture than blade. Your weapon, once a symbol of class, is now collateral for meals. Do you polish it nightly out of pride, or because it may buy another week if pawned discreetly? The thought stings more than hunger. Not all Ronin choose the quiet road. Some, like Yui Shosetsu in the 17th century, plotted uprisings convinced that masterless men could reshape the political map. His conspiracy unraveled, crushed before it lit, but the rumor of it lingered, proof that desperation can make ideology look like salvation. Others joined gangs along highways, the word Ronin stretched into insult for anyone too violent, too poor, or too free to fit neat categories. And yet the gray isn't only bleak. In cities like Edo and Kyoto, Ronin became teachers, fencing instructors, even actors in the floating world's theaters. Students didn't ask who your lord was. They asked whether your cut was straight, your philosophy sound. You think of Miyamoto Musashi, again technically a Ronin most of his life, who dueled, painted, wrote the Book of Five Rings, and died with no lord but his own mind. His story tempts you, maybe freedom can be its own banner. Still, the tension persists. The code says you must avenge insults. But what if the insult comes from a customer whose coins keep you eating? The scrolls say you should carry yourself with pride, yet you find yourself bowing deeper to merchants than you ever did to your daimyo. The contradiction is constant. and you either bend or break. Some nights you call this pragmatism, other nights betrayal. Which is it? Perhaps both, depending on who's asking. You recall a comrade who turned Ronin after his house fell in scandal. He took work as a temple guard, ringing bells and sweeping leaves, muttering that this was the closest Bushido allowed him to peace. When famine struck, he handed out temple rice to villagers, breaking rules that no one punished him for because they were too busy surviving. He died without glory, but the villagers remembered him as the man who kept their children alive. Was his honor bent or simply translated into another dialect? The streets at night test you most. Once, with retainers and banners, you walked proudly, lantern light clearing space ahead. Now, you move like everyone else, negotiating alleys with eyes down, your swords covered in cloth. A drunk bumps you, slurs an insult, and you measure three options: walk away, strike, or laugh it off. The Bushido manuals never rehearse this scene. You choose laughter, and the drunk stumbles on, leaving you with pride intact, but trembling in your stomach. Stories of Ronin vendettas stir the public imagination. Plays and kabuki theaters celebrate men who sacrifice comfort for revenge, like the 47. The audience cheers, but you know the hunger that lingers behind the curtain, the worry about shoes wearing thin. People adore the myth of noble Ronin, but forget the thousands who quietly taught sword forms to neighborhood children and scraped through winter on pickled radish. You walk among the unsung, the unromantic, the real. The code bends further when family is involved. You remember pawning a short sword to buy medicine for your child. The broker's eyes flicking with judgment and pity. Did you dishonor your ancestors or honor your child more deeply? Later, when your daughter recovered, you retrieved the blade, its shine dulled, but its presence heavier than before. Every time you draw it now, you see her sleeping form instead of an enemy's. Bushido never included that footnote, but you carry it like scripture. A letter arrives from a distant acquaintance offering you a place in his household if you can stomach the terms less pay. Stricter rules service in a province prone to floods. You sit with it by the hearth, staring at the ink until it swims. Rejoin the ladder or keep walking the uncertain road. The paper trembles in your hand, and you realize that Ronin life is less about exile and more about constant choosing. Freedom is exhausting precisely because no code makes the choices for you. Night deepens, and you pass a row of stalls shutting down. A vendor nods at you without fear. Perhaps you stopped a thief near his shop, once unpaid, but noticed. That small nod restores more dignity than any coin. You settle under an eave. Sandals, drying sword at your side, not as badge, but as companion. Honor hasn't vanished. It's simply quieter, stretched thin, improvised in gestures, polite refusals, small kindnesses, discipline that no lord enforces anymore. You fall asleep to the sound of rain on tile and the murmur of distant bells, knowing tomorrow you'll negotiate again, work or wander, bend or stand, feed the code, or feed the stomach. For Ronin honor is no longer a fortress. It is a lantern flame, fragile, flickering, carried carefully against the wind. The scissors make a faint crunch as they shear through your top knot, and the sound is louder in your chest than it is in the room. Hair once bound with pride drops into a tray, and with it falls centuries of ritual. You feel oddly light, like a page torn free. The Meiji government's decree reaches even into your household, saying samurai are no longer samurai, that swords must be left at home unless ceremonial. The code you drilled, bled, and whispered to yourself through long nights now finds itself shoved into museums and textbooks. Yet the hooks of honor don't let go so easily. The sword may be banned from the street, but you still find yourself bowing at the right depth. When meeting someone's eyes, still arranging your sandals neatly before stepping onto tatami, still breathing once before answering a question. Bushido lingers in your muscles, like ink that never fully fades, an afterimage of training that outlives the paper it was written on. The streets look different. Police officers stand where samurai patrols once marched their uniforms, Western cut their pistols holstered in place of swords. And yet listen closely, their manuals echo the old language: discipline, duty, loyalty, restraint. The daisho set may be gone, but the idea of carrying visible responsibility hasn't disappeared. It's been translated. Like a poem shifted into a new meter, the rhythm is altered, but the meaning peeks through. Schools, too, adopt fragments of the code. Children line up, bow in unison, recite maxims about honesty and perseverance. You recognize the structure instantly. Dojo etiquette, dressed in chalk dust and textbooks. Teachers may never mention Bushido, but the echo is there, in the cadence of morning greetings, in the insistence on straight posture. Perhaps every society, after all, needs a warrior skeleton beneath its civilian flesh. You think of Saigo Takamori, hailed as the last true samurai, who rebelled against Meiji modernization and died in 1877 at Shiroyama, sword in hand, against rifles and cannon. His statue stands in Ueno Park Dog at his side, a reminder that codes resist erasure, even when history insists on upgrades. People lay flowers at his feet, not because they want samurai rule back, but because they sense that honor still deserves a place, however reshaped. The world changes its costumes. Railroads cut through valleys, telegraphs hum, but you still feel the old lessons in your daily rhythm. When your employer scolds you unfairly, you swallow the first hot word and let silence do its work, just as a samurai once hid temper behind a mask. When your neighbor's child stumbles, you reach out to steady them with a hand that learned steadiness in the dojo. When your own son complains of chores, you remind him gently that discipline is the thread keeping tomorrow from unraveling. Outside Japan, Bushido takes on new lives. Writers romanticize it for novels, generals cite it in speeches, even corporations borrow its terms to dress loyalty in a suit and tie. Some uses feel shallow, others surprisingly faithful. You chuckle at the idea of a salesman quoting the Hagakure before pitching tea leaves, but you also sense the truth. Honor codes never truly die. They migrate, adapt, disguise themselves. At night, you walk the same alleys you once patrolled, now lit with gas lamps and the chatter of shopkeepers selling imported cloth. No one bows deeply at the sight of your figure anymore. You are simply another man among many. And yet when a fire breaks out in the distance, you feel your legs tense, ready to run with buckets as you did before. The law no longer commands it, but habit does. That is Bushido's real afterglow reflex. carved so deeply into the body, it doesn't need an order. You pause at a small tea house. Inside, laughter rises as two clerks sip cheap sake and argue about politics. Their words are brash, their postures sloppy, but you catch a glimmer of something. One refills the other's cup before touching his own, an old courtesy, wearing a new shirt. You smile, recognizing the code hiding in plain sight, like a friend who shaved his beard, but still speaks with the same voice. Even in quiet moments at home, you notice the residue. You still place your sword, though now dulled, across the alcove in respect before bowing toward the family shrine. You still rise early to sweep, remembering that order begins with brooms before blades. You still write letters with brush and ink, even though others switch to ballpoints, because a brush forces your mind to move slower, more deliberate, more honest. History says the samurai are gone. You know better. They survive not in armor displays, but in how people hold their backs straight during trials, in the patience of a craftsman sanding wood, in the silence someone keeps instead of lashing out. Bushido lives not as a banner, but as a ghost in posture, in habit, in the choices you make when no one is watching. You step out into the cool night air, hair lighter, hands empty, but your walk steady. A boy runs